did a major evaluation of the technology and the revenue structures and basically concluded that motor fuel taxes are going to be important for a long time, that, depending upon the rate of technological progress, turnover in the fleet, and so on, we would still be collecting a fair amount of money from gasoline taxes well into the foreseeable future. They were looking at 3 decades at the time. I think that keeps moving forward. It's probably still 3 decades where gasoline taxes are likely to be an important revenue source. They also concluded at the time that VMT taxes and fees, vehicle mile travel taxes and fees, would be desirable, but that at the time neither the technology nor the political environment would make them very feasible. That there were new sources of revenue that should be phased in, and they also put a big emphasis on promoting research into the new technologies, in particular looking at a lot of the intelligent transportation systems and trying to identify how a lot of that information could be used in a revenue collection system. Remember, up to that point, most of the discussion had been about using information to improve traffic flow and for a variety of other reasons. Now we're starting to get the revenue people coming in and saying, well, wait a minute, if we can track vehicles and we can track their usage on roads, we can also use that information for collecting revenue for the usage of the roads. And so, given that as a background, the last legislative session, the Oregon legislature actually created what is called the Road User Fee Task Force, or RUFTUF for short. And RUFTUF is charged with coming up with a demonstration project to both identify a set of technologies that could be used to collect revenue and to, in effect, follow through with the Oregon Department of Transportation on testing out this set of technologies to demonstrate their feasibility and so on. Now, it's important to understand that the major focus of the legislature in putting RUFTUF together was revenue. They are mostly concerned with what are we going to do if the gas tax should go away, and how are we going to fund roads into the future. On the other hand, the federal government has a program that's been in place now for about 10 years called the Value Pricing Program. The Value Pricing Program is an attempt to use the revenue generation mechanisms, the pricing of roads, as a way of also improving the management of the road system. Primarily, the initial emphasis was on some forms of congestion pricing and on using congestion pricing as a mechanism for for both revenue raising, management, and improving efficiency in the use of the system. Well, as I said, RUFTUF was not particularly concerned about this until they got some money from the Value Pricing Program. And since they now have support from the Value Pricing Program, the list of options that they're going to consider for user fees is also going to include consideration of congestion pricing of some sort or another as a method of controlling congestion and more efficiently using the road system. And to give you a little bit of idea, some of the information put together by the Road User Fee Task Force, just a couple of quick slides. They concluded that our fuel and auto taxes are among the lowest in the nation. The comparisons here are all with the western states. And as you see, we're about average with the gasoline tax, just about the same as everyone else. We don't have a sales tax, which many other states do. And the other vehicle taxes and fees are amongst the lowest. So the actual taxation of vehicles is relatively low in Oregon. These are all on a cents per mile basis. It's important to recognize, however, that for many of the other states, much of that revenue is not used for the road fund. In Oregon, we have a constitutional requirement that any revenue collected on the basis of vehicle usage is effectively dedicated to the road fund. And so one of the reasons why we don't see some of these taxes is that if they were levied, they would be going into the road fund. And as I said, what you're seeing in many of the other states is the taxes are levied for other purposes. But the real concern for RUFTUF is this, and that's the implication of improving fuel efficiency over time and what that might do to the money that would be going into the road fund. And the top line, the black, dark black, I guess is the way it's looking out there, is the historical rate of increase and what you might expect based upon historic trends for vehicle usage and improvements in vehicle fuel efficiency. I mean, one of the things that you do have to recognize is that over time, vehicles have become relatively more fuel efficient, and that does have an impact on the revenue collection system. And then they have a couple of scenarios with higher mile per gallons and or better fuel efficiency, and what that would mean for the road fund over a 20-year period. And as you can see, the implications at the extreme are well over, I guess, about a 40%, 50% decline relative to the trend line and an actual decline relative to current income. And so this is the source of the concern. Now, the question that we were, Rob and I were asked by ODOT to take a look at background information for Rough Tough in terms of what they would need to look at in putting together an alternative to the gas tax. And so first thing we did was what happened between 1995 and the time we did this study, and a couple of the basic conclusions of the literature review. The near-term impact of alternative fuel vehicles is likely to still be small. This was a conclusion from the NCHRP report in 1995, and we didn't see much that had happened since then to indicate that it was going to be a major source of revenue decline. The bigger concern was the impact due to high fuel efficiency. And of course, within that time period, we saw the hybrid cars and a number of other differences that might lead you to expect that much higher fuel efficiency is potentially available. On the other hand, if you actually look at the trend over the time, one of the things that we were seeing, of course, is the growth in the SUVs and so on. So higher fuel efficiency was not having as much of an impact as it might, but there certainly is a potential for that. The other big change was the improvement in the technology for tolling, which basically had been demonstrated by the value pricing projects, SR91 in Southern California, I-15 in San Diego, a variety of other applications, have basically indicated that it is much more efficient to toll roads than it was 20 years ago. You no longer have to stop, like if you're on some of the roads on the East Coast, you're no longer stopping every few miles and throwing change into a basket or paying someone. With the new systems, you can just drive on through. And so the collection of the tolls has become relatively more feasible. And of course, with the more automatic tolls, you can start using variable pricing, and we've seen a number of applications of the variable pricing through the value pricing program. And even in places where the tolls used to be fixed on the East Coast, they're starting to look at using variable pricing and so on. So tolling is becoming a much more acceptable mechanism for raising revenue because the user cost, the compliance cost on the driver has been reduced. On the other hand, it is also very clear that there is extreme resistance to the use of pricing on previously free roads. And under ICE-T, there was a demonstration program that was going to allow up to 5 regions to price the interstates, and they really couldn't find very many takers for this demonstration project. So clearly, the political obstacles to using tolls on previously free roads are fairly substantial. What value pricing program did demonstrate was that it's certainly feasible to do selective pricing, but that in general, it's most feasible when you're providing better service. And what we see in terms of the successful value pricing programs are that they are in supplements to existing road systems where you are basically providing a higher level of service for a price as opposed to pricing previously free service. The other thing that became apparent in doing the literature review is that nobody is using tolling to replace or reduce gas taxes. All of the applications that we have for value pricing in the United States are in addition to gas taxes. And if you look in Europe, where we have cordon pricing and a variety of other examples of revenue-raising mechanisms. They are also used to raise additional revenue. They do not use them to reduce gas taxes. Now, this raises a number of issues. One of the things that came out, well, a number of issues came out of the value pricing program. One is that if you're going to start pricing and providing different levels of service, the question arises as to what levels of service should you provide? Should there be only one alternative or should there be many? How do you make decisions about what the efficiency and demand on the part of the users would be? And how do you determine the most effective use of pricing for the management of the road system? There have actually been some studies that suggest that pricing selectively may actually be worse than not pricing at all. There's a whole series of research on these issues. The next question we raised for Rough Tough was, are they looking to replace the gas tax or to supplement it? And that becomes a major issue in terms of both the political feasibility and the mechanisms that you're going to be using. What you find, basically, is that the gas tax is an extremely nice tax system. It is relatively low cost to collect. It's typically collected at the wholesale level, so there are relatively few taxpayers. And although everybody thinks they're paying it at the pump, in fact, the tax has been collected at the wholesale level. So it's a very simple system. And the cost of collection, the administrative costs, are quite low. As you get into toll systems, they're much more expensive to operate. What we observe, though, is with the technological progress and some of the things that Rob's going to be talking about, the cost of collecting the tolls has been declining over time, and we expect that they will continue to decline. The other things that came out just briefly out of the value pricing program, they found that simple projects are more likely to be implemented and successful, that there have been a number of proposals for fairly elaborate pricing programs, and they all ran into various roadblocks, either political or otherwise, that prevented them from actually being implemented. And again, if you look at Europe, the systems that are in place there were all also relatively simple. And the final concern is the equity considerations. You've probably all heard about Lexus lanes and the concern that using pricing would somehow or another price low-income people off the roads and just allow high-income people to use them. The actual findings from the value pricing programs do not support that contention. Most of the value pricing programs find that the use of the price lanes is a little bit more for relatively higher income families, but that actual usage pretty much mirrors the usage of the freeways that are adjacent. The argument, again, is that for many relatively low-income people, it's still worth it to pay $4 or $5 to save 20 minutes. The usual example is, somebody who has a child in daycare where they charge $1 a minute for being late in Southern California. That $5 toll might look very good relative to being an additional 20 minutes late. So there are a lot of concerns. In general, the equity considerations are lower when you're using the fee to supplement the gas tax. We really don't have a lot of information about what happens in terms of the distribution of the tax burden when we completely replace the gas tax. Some of the economic issues that we identified for them, as you may be aware, the hybrid vehicles here in Oregon get much better gas mileage, so they contribute less to the road fund. And so last legislative session, they decided to double the registration fees on hybrid vehicles to at least partially make up for the reduced contributions to the road fund. As you may have guessed, that was not politically very popular. It's certainly a feasible alternative to basically change the registration fees on the basis of fuel efficiency in order to look at the contribution to the road fund. But it really doesn't appear to be the best approach. Road pricing, both from a conceptual and for a variety of other political reasons, appears to be a more viable approach to charging for the use of roads rather than trying to use registration fees. Again, the current systems are tolls, but the technology, as Rob's going to be talking about, is making much more sophisticated pricing systems feasible. The basic problem with the advanced systems is that they're very costly, and there are a lot of concerns about privacy. And so Actual implementation is likely to be phased in over time if you're looking at some of the really sophisticated potential pricing systems. And as I said, the questions of privacy have been raised in virtually every discussion of the use of the more sophisticated systems that actually track the use of the vehicle. And then the final issue that we run into is we can do revenue estimates for complete replacement of the gas tax relatively easily. 1.2 cents per mile or whatever, and you can easily look at what a complete replacement of the gas tax would generate. But when you're looking at partial replacement, there are a lot of issues in terms of the usage of vehicles, and in particular, as I'll discuss just briefly, the question of in-state versus out-of-state usage and how you're going to tax that would affect your revenue estimates. And from the perspective of how much revenue are we going to get, understanding what that revenue is going to be is an important consideration. Equity issues, again. You have vehicle classes, you have different income groups, you have different geographic regions, and all of these are raised as concerns in how the revenue is going to be raised. The other thing that comes out of the economic analysis is that, while we generally think pricing is better than taxing, the pricing systems that they're looking at, especially just straight VMT fees, are pretty close to the gas tax. And there really isn't a huge improvement in efficiency relative to the gas tax in terms of the inducements for driving, use of the roads, and so on. It's only if you actually get into congestion pricing that you would see a substantial improvement in the efficiency with which the road system is managed and used. And then the final issue is the replacement is likely to create coordination issues. So, for example, if Oregon were to go to a straight VMT fee, which is one of the things being considered, and replace their 24-cent a gallon gasoline tax, we would then have a very large differential in gas taxes between Oregon and Washington. Now, large differentials do exist. For example, New Jersey, I think, has like around a 10%, 10.5 cent gasoline tax as compared to 23 or 24% in adjacent states. And that doesn't seem to create big problems. On the other hand, getting across the borders in those states usually requires payment of a toll for most of the major crossing points, and that may mitigate some of the impact. So it's possible to have these large differentials, but we really think they're going to create some potential problems with respect to people in Washington coming over here to buy zero tax gas and so on, if that's the way that we finally ultimately end up. And so that's going to have to be dealt with. And then, of course, the transition from the existing system to the new system is likely to create all kinds of problems and concerns. We came up with a number of issues for Rough Tough to consider as they were designing this alternative. And just briefly, some of the considerations are we going to continue the fuel tax, or are they going to completely replace it? And if so, how are they going to phase it in? The question of out-of-state mileage. If you think about it, the gas tax basically taxes a vehicle where it's using the road. So if you're driving in Washington, you're likely to fill up in Washington. If you're driving in Idaho, you're going to buy gas in Idaho. So you're paying taxes to the state in which you're driving. On the other hand, your registration fee only goes to your home state. And so we really have two different approaches to how we deal with the taxation of the vehicle, whether it's the home state collecting all of the revenue or whether the revenue should be more closely tied to the usage of the road. And so that becomes an issue for vehicles registered in Oregon driving in other states. Are we going to tax them for their mileage in other states? In other words, just total use of the vehicle. Or are we going to only tax them for the in-state mileage? And the other question then is, how do you tax the out-of-state vehicles, and how do you want to deal with that? The issue of charging for social costs, it's been raised. In general, we think that Rough Tough is sort of staying away from that, and for good reason. The idea for social costs is things like taxing for the pollution that automobiles generate. But in general, the charges for social costs are different from the charges that are being made for using the road system. And they certainly need to address it. I think the general conclusion is that they're not going to be concerned with that. They're really their primary focus is on raising revenue for the road system. The time horizon for implementation, again, if you're looking at trying to do something in the near term, in the next 2 or 3 years, it's very different than if you're looking at a 20 or 30-year phase-in period, both in terms of the technology, the politics, and a variety of other issues. The question of whether you want to do congestion pricing or not. The level of administrative costs. This one, again, is a big concern when you're moving away from the gas tax. The gas tax has a relatively low administrative cost, and when you start looking at all of the alternatives, the administrative costs rise rapidly as a percentage of the revenue that's being collected and become a much bigger concern. And the more sophisticated the pricing system, the bigger a concern the administrative costs become. And then, of course, the type of technology and implications for privacy. And I think we're into technology issues, so I'm going to turn it over to Rob.
Thank you. Tony, shifting gears a little bit to talk about technology. In our initial work that we did for the task force, we looked at what advancements in technology had occurred since 1995, basically. So here are just a few. I mean, everyone's aware that a lot changed during this time, and these are some issues relevant for this kind of application. Telecommunications have changed in that time frame. The penetration rate of cellular phones is enormous now in this country. Over 100 million cellular phones. Probably quite a few in this room, actually. Sometimes we may hear them go off. And the other point about national coverage is that the analog cellular system provides nearly nationwide coverage. So there are applications that use, nationwide applications that require communications that use analog cellular, and there are these applications in the freight and passenger transportation areas. So there are nationwide applications requiring wireless communications. So that's something that didn't really exist in 1995, or when the work was done that culminated in the 1995 report. The world of toll collection changed a lot since the mid-90s. At that time, there was concern that the public or that people would not readily adopt the use of transponders for paying tolls. There were privacy concerns, but what most agencies find is that 99.9% of the people want the transponders. They don't want to stop and pay toll. They don't even really care that much about remaining anonymous. While most tolling systems allow people to remain anonymous and pay by cash, most people really aren't that concerned about that. So we have toll tags everywhere that are doing lots of things. Toll tags in some cities, they hand them out and people will keep them in their vehicle, and then they'll pass under a tag reader, several tag readers at certain points on the freeway, and then the DOT can measure travel time for thousands of vehicles and calculate the mean and then provide that travel time information to users. And it's also a signal for the freeway managers if the travel time goes up. There could be an incident or something like this. So toll tags are out there in people's vehicles. There was even an example in Southern California where you could go through the McDonald's drive-through with your Orange County toll tag. So there have been demonstrations of doing more than just pricing and providing travel information. So maybe we'll all have toll tags or smart cards eventually where we buy our coffee and pay our toll. So a lot has changed in the world of toll collection, and I think, like Tony was saying, the issue of toll collection, the issue of constructing toll plazas is no longer really an issue. It's actually to actually build the facility is not as costly. A toll tag reader is about $10,000. Of course, you have to install it somewhere, and so the costs go up from there. But the reader itself, if you have an overhead sign, for about $10,000 you can install one. In the toll tags themselves, I'm sorry I didn't bring one, but they're very inexpensive. I'd say under $1 in cost, something like that. So what I say here is that nationwide we've seen what most people agree is exceptional adoption of toll collection payment technologies. They're exceptionally reliable. I mean, the agencies that deploy these require that that the contractors that install and maintain the toll collection systems meet something like 99.9% reliability. and there are large penalties if they don't. And people in surveys seem to accept this technology and are not concerned about privacy. Yes? Sure.
About the toll tags.
Yes.
Has there been a response of kind of an underworld market for it, or counterfeit toll tags, so people are skirting the system?
I would say I mean, with any system like this, there's going to be a small percentage of people who will try to find their way around the system. I don't have any, hard evidence of that at this moment, but I think, as in any revenue collection system, and maybe Tony could talk about this a little bit later, any revenue collection system, you have a percentage of violators. So other changes that have occurred technology-wise, data processing and storage is now less and less of a barrier for collecting millions of data points and processing them. It's no longer really an issue. Storing data is less and less of an issue. So there are devices that could exist on the vehicle or off the vehicle. So communications, toll collection, data processing, storage. A little bit about the autos themselves. I mean, the autos have improved in terms of, the auto companies are looking for ways to generate more revenue so that there are safety and security enhancements available on many vehicles now. I think this has not been something that has been adopted very quickly, but there are what we call Mayday or telematics systems on many vehicles. So some of you are familiar with OnStar. Other companies have systems with different names. There are aftermarket devices that you can buy so that if you need help, you can basically press a button and you'll be connected with some sort of service center to get you the help that you need. I'll talk a little more about the details of this, but we're doing navigation in vehicles now. So the auto industry has kind of evolved a little bit over this time frame as well. And then finally, which I'm not going to talk about too much, is that the propulsion systems are shifting, and of course there are hybrid vehicles and let's say hydrogen-fueled vehicles are coming, but not very quickly. So I think it's really relevant for us to be thinking about these things and asking these questions. Some technology issues, if you're going to, we tried to step back pretty far and ask ourselves, well, if you were going to replace the gas tax, what kind of data, what kind of systems could you imagine? So we tried to use our imagination, and we tried not to restrict ourselves too much at the beginning. So the issues that we identified at the beginning, you may want to know when and where a vehicle is at a certain point. And so you can collect location information periodically and translate that to distance traveled. Or you could just collect distance information, and irrespective of where the vehicle is actually traveling. The issue with location is if you know where a vehicle is or has traveled, then that allows you to do things like cordon pricing and possibly even congestion pricing for particular road segments if your location data is detailed enough. So you can measure location and time. Distance you can either calculate, measure, or report somehow. The issue with communication is somehow there needs to be communication with the vehicle. So the vehicle either can somehow transmit or store location information. So the communication could be manual. Someone could walk up to the vehicle and read a number off a dial or a little screen, or data could be transmitted through a wireless, some sort of wireless communication, whether short range or long range. So in short range, you're talking about radio frequency communication, RF, which is the communication technology used with toll tags. And there are different kinds of RF communications, one-way or two-way. So, and then, of course, different forms of longer range, what we typically think of as cellular communications. Even beyond that, there would be satellite communications. This communication can occur at different frequency levels. It can be monthly, weekly, daily, hourly, minute by minute, second by second, so you can go down to a very fine level of communication. The communication can occur either at fixed points, so you can have fixed points on the transportation network that allow vehicles to communicate, or you can basically try to cover the whole state, the whole region, and communicate kind of wherever the vehicles are. So there's sort of two approaches. And in thinking about technology, clearly cost is a big issue. How do you enforce, if you have a device on a vehicle, if somebody puts aluminum foil over the little antenna that you're using to communicate with the device, how do you enforce or deter people from doing that? Administration, it was a big question that we were thinking about in terms of technology. So would there be a service center that would be receiving data and processing it and then doing the fee collection? Tony already mentioned the issue with our surrounding states. Clearly there are border issues. If we're pricing by the mile for Oregon drivers, it's going to be hard or actually impossible to charge people for driving on Washington's roads unless there's some sort of consistent system. If we had a nationwide system that was consistent, that could be sorted out. So we talked about things like at major border crossings having sort of entry point devices that would sort of switch on or off the VMT pricing fee. And so those are some of the things that the task force is still looking at. Who are the partners with technology? We talked about the fact that vehicles' technologies have changed. So many vehicles have, let's say, the capabilities of recording miles traveled right now. I'd say almost every new vehicle certainly coming off the line has an odometer, a digital odometer that records mileage, and so it would not be hard if the system were designed properly to actually have the auto companies build in a system for reporting miles traveled. So the pieces are there. It's just merely a communication protocol that would need to be changed. And in fact, vehicles with navigation systems could do more than that. They could keep track of entry or exit across certain cordon lines, and that's really just a software issue and an institutional issue. It's not going to require additional hardware. So a little bit about, just a little visual, in case you didn't realize what cellular coverage looked like. The red area is a rough estimate of the cellular coverage using analog technology. So pretty much most of the country, there's this little part of Oregon in the southeast that's not covered, but the digital cellular is basically focused around the urban areas. So as I mentioned, these Mayday systems that I'll speak to a little bit in a minute, they rely on the analog cellular coverage for providing nationwide security and safety for drivers. So I think we can only imagine that communications will continue to evolve where ultimately there will be high quality coverage across the whole country. Another issue that has come up recently, that came up in our study, is that cellular providers have been supposedly required to provide location information when the user calls 911. So now, from your landline phone, if you call 911, the response center has your location. So they're on their screen, they're looking at your address. In the case of, for example, facilities with hazardous materials, the emergency responders also have links on computers that show floor plans and where hazardous materials are. So with the landline, the issue of where are you and how can we get to you is pretty much resolved. But with cellular phones, basically now you have to self-report where you are. And if you think about it, if you're traveling somewhere, let's say driving somewhere, and something happens and you call 911, you may not know where you are. You may not know what the last exit was that you passed. Most roads or freeways have milepost markers, but can you see the milepost marker? Is it dark? So there are lots of examples where emergency responders, for example, a barrier-separated freeway, they might go to the wrong side of the freeway, and so, or they might spend a long time looking for where this disabled vehicle is, or this person with an emergency. So there's been a concern that people don't self-report location accurately. Even transportation professionals, don't self-report location very well. In we've been working with some incident data around the state of Oregon, and it's very difficult for people to identify exactly where they are on a road because we have all sort of non-standard ways of referring to roads and intersections, and people have different sort of anecdotal or local names for roads that don't match highway numbers. So basically, the FCC mandated a couple of years ago that cellular providers provide location capability, and that created a little sub-industry of companies trying to test different ways of establishing location. So a couple quick examples. I call a network solution, or we call it a network solution, where you could triangulate. If I turn on my cell phone, there may be 3 towers that are picking up my signal. The actual communication occurs over the strongest signal, but using that sort of triangulation, you could roughly pinpoint my location. And so there have been some experiments to do that. There are other network solutions where you can measure signal strength over a whole city and use signal profiles to identify location. Probably the one that we will see and that we do see now available in handsets is global positioning systems. So this is just a picture of the first GPS phone that came out at the end of 2001. And so these are being tested in various regions, and I think there are some being tested here in the Portland area through AT&T. So the next few years, the date by which all phones were supposed to have location has passed several years ago, but the industry, the large phone providers have announced that they're going to meet the mandate sometime, but I'm not sure exactly what the date's going to be. But eventually we will have location capabilities in phones. So I already mentioned a little bit about global positioning systems, but just a brief little intro to what that is. We have satellites flying around above us that allow, with a little receiver, allow us to be located very accurately, generally speaking. There are some problems with receiving the signal in urban areas that is still an issue, but the Coast Guard has actually deployed some land-based stations to improve GPS signals. So actually we get pretty good signals here in Oregon because we're close to the coast and there are some repeater stations very close by. So at the moment, GPS gives you a guaranteed 30-meter accuracy. What we actually get is a lot better than that. This is just an example. One thing that happened is in 2001, prior to 2001, the federal government had been scrambling the signal, making GPS less accurate for security reasons. However, in actually May 2000, they turned off that scrambling. So this is just a little sample that we can get down below 10 meters. If you're near a land-based system, you can really get down below 1 meter accuracy, assuming you can get the signal. And so that is something, there's a nationwide push to improve the land-based systems. So GPS is more and more accurate. Probably several of you have worked with it a little bit. We have, over in the ITS lab, we have some data collection devices using GPS where we actually go out and record travel time and speed. And of course, the TriMet buses, as many of you know, have GPS that allows TriMet to manage their system and then allows Tom Kimple to analyze the data. So GPS is something that is getting better and getting more prevalent. So there are probably, I would say, between 1 and 2 million vehicles at least that have telematics systems out on the streets right now. And so telematics is a combination of wireless voice and data communications with GPS and some sort of little onboard computing system that allows drivers to receive information through the voice connection, to transmit data over the data connection, and it allows their location to be known. So this is just a picture of the OnStar user interface, which is not very complicated. It's basically 3 buttons. And so which is actually good because people should not be distracted while driving. But you can press the center button and establish a voice connection with an OnStar operator. The red cross button would be a roadside assistance button. One of the things that is a selling point on telematics systems is that they are set up so that if your airbag deploys, basically the car has a few cellular phones in it. And so if your airbag deploys, the car automatically dials the OnStar service center number and reports your information to the service center and says, Mr. Bertini's airbag has deployed. He's located on, Southwest 5th and Montgomery. And then so the operator can then contact the local 911 center here and also try to talk to me so that they would see if I was okay, try to make voice contact. If it was a false alarm, sometimes airbags go off and it's not an emergency. They could report that, but if it was an emergency or if they couldn't contact me by voice, they would stay in touch with the 911 center here in Portland until someone got to my vehicle. And they could also, tell the responder what kind of car it was, pretty much exactly where it was located, what color the car was. And also, if, for example, I had a medical condition of some sort, that could also be reported, could be in the database. It could be reported to the 911 responder. Other things that the OnStar-like systems do is if you lock your, it's hard to do this now, but I guess you can still lock your keys in the car or somehow get locked out of your car. But you can, assuming you have your phone with you or that there's a phone nearby, you can call the service center and they can remotely unlock the door. They basically, they will effectively call your car because it has a unique phone number and send a code to unlock the doors, assuming you provide the right password and so on. Other things that these systems can do is if your car gets stolen, that they can track it remotely. And many of the auto companies are providing what they call concierge services. So if you hit the OnStar button and you want, today's Valentine's Day, if you want to order some flowers, they can do that for you. If you want hotel information, where's the nearest gas station? So there are services along those lines. That's not really related to road pricing. But once you have location and where's the free road, maybe you can find out. But the basic point here is that vehicles have location and communications already, which are really required as the backbone for any pricing system that would replace gas tax. This is just a picture, a schematic. Most of the cars have several phones in hardened areas of the vehicle to try to protect them, yes.
Do you have to pay additional for the service?
Yes. I think now, as I recall, some of the auto companies will, if you buy the system with the vehicle, they'll give you a few years free service with it. Actually, I've seen some data showing that not everybody renews the service after it stops being free, but I think there are people who do want that kind of, probably more the airbag, the safety aspect of it. And it's, you can pay more, and I've been in vehicles where, people I was riding with were trying them out, let's say, on an experimental basis, and I can tell you some stories about that later. We did then consider a series of specific technologies, and including just basically the odometer that's on the vehicle now. Basically, the hub odometer would be some sort of an add-on type odometer that, say, would be a secure, tamper-proof add-on that if you wanted every vehicle, starting next year to participate in this system, that they could either be required to purchase or the state could provide an add-on odometer for every vehicle so that there would be standard equipment across the whole fleet. We considered GPS. We considered an array of communications types. And then a few little buzzwords here. Automatic vehicle identification, or AVI, is something that is sort of a standard system that we have, and that's what's used in toll collection applications. So AVI is where you have a fixed point on the road, and you have vehicles passing by, and you identify that when each vehicle passes. And so that's kind of the toll tag example. Automatic vehicle location is basically the TriMet bus example. Okay, you have vehicles everywhere on the road, and you can locate them wherever they are. And so you may choose certain times to have the vehicles report their location, or you may choose to vary that. You may want to have the vehicle report their location every few minutes under certain circumstances. This is just a picture of AVI. So we basically looked at those two general categories of technology for locating and identifying vehicles. I've been using the toll tag example. There are other systems for identifying vehicles at fixed points. Video recognition of license plates is one big one that's out there. There's a small system being tested in Oregon on Highway 18 that identifies a license plate and tries to match that license plate 20 or 30 miles down the road to assess travel time. In London, at the moment, they're adding a pricing component to central London. So they've sort of designated a cordon in the city of London, and so they have cameras at every entry and exit point in that cordon, and they're identifying license plates, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and trying to determine whether people have paid their entry and exit fee. So this is used for video recognition of license plates is also used for toll enforcement, and interestingly for origin destination surveys we use the same technology. But it will be interesting to see how the London system operates. I know there have been a lot of sort of field trips to London. The value pricing group I think has visited London to see what's happening.
It starts on the 17th.
Starts on the 17th, so next week.
A little bit different from what you described. They're going to check to see if you've paid when you come. I think it's going to be implemented starting February 17th, and what they do is they have cameras in London, and if you're driving around in London, you have to call in and pay your toll, and if you don't call in and they track your license plate, then they fine you. I think that's the way it's supposed to work.
Very interesting. Well, maybe we'll invite someone from London to come and talk about that. This is a little schematic for AVL, and so these are systems that exist that operate that would be applicable to a statewide pricing system. Just a few words on this. Fleets use AVL extensively for internal fleet management. So it's something that is used for fleets that have nationwide territories. And one of the other things with AVL is that perhaps a state who wanted a statewide pricing system could get the auto companies organized and have the auto companies actually provide the VMT data. The task force didn't really go for that idea, but that would be a possibility, I think, in the future. Now, these next slides sort of cover the transition from the studies that PSU conducted, and some study participants are in this room. Carrie and Shazia helped with earlier versions of the study. So these slides are actually from a team of researchers from Oregon State University, and I just wanted to go through them quickly. These are all on the Rough Tough website, and I'll give you the address at the end. But they broke this down into about 6 actual technology scenarios and analyzed them in detail, and then made some recommendations. So I just want to talk about what those scenarios were. The first one they called the Fee Collection Center, and the little schematic with the green boxes shows that this would be sort of the AVL solution, where each vehicle would have GPS, would have cellular communications, and then would somehow and at some frequency transmit their distance traveled to the Fee Collection Center. The center would then process that data and send the users a bill. Okay, so this is sort of the GPS version. Option 2 would be similar. The vehicle would still have a GPS system. It would still record where and how much it traveled. But there would be a short-range communication device, basically an RF device, And the vehicle, rather than transmitting data on the cellular system, would transmit data at a service station. So there would be a communication system that would have to be installed at every service station to receive miles traveled data from the vehicles that were participating in the system. So this is what we would call an exact calculation of distance traveled. And then the VMT could be communicated to the service station or to a data and fee collection center from there. Another option would be, in scenario 1, sort of a sub-option, would be that the vehicle would have an odometer that could communicate total distance traveled to an RF reader, again at a service station. And let's see, scenario 2 is more involved with the service station. So there would actually be VMT data calculated at the pump. And so you could envision several different systems for this. Assume we keep the gas tax, so you fill up your vehicle, and your vehicle is then transmitting your VMT to the pump. The pump could then calculate, well, do you owe additional fees in addition to the gas tax, and then could charge you for those fees. Another system could keep track of your credit or debit, and they're talking about using the state income tax as a way of refunding. So if you pay too much with the gas tax based on your VMT, then you would get a credit through your income tax return. So scenario 2 could use either GPS or an odometer. Okay, so you could calculate the VMT several different ways and then communicate to the fuel pump. And I think there are about 1,800 service stations in Oregon, so basically each pump, each service station would have to be retrofitted over some time period to make this work. And one point is that this was, again, OSU's part of the study. I want to be sure to give them credit. They found that the new gas pump industry is actually a very interesting industry, that the new gas pumps do have rather sophisticated capabilities. So it wasn't too much of a stretch to imagine that new gas pumps that will have other capabilities would be able to handle this. But there would clearly be a cost connected with that. Scenario 3 basically is a switch system. So rather than keeping the gas tax for everybody and then calculating the credit, if you had an RF tag and when you pulled into the service station, for you the gas tax would be turned off. So you would be charged for the fuel only, and then you would pay the VMT fee on top of it. So there would not be any sort of credit or debit over and above or below the gas tax that you would pay. So you would pay the pure VMT fee at the service station. Another way, still interacting with service stations, would be to have an estimated VMT calculation, and you could use your standard EPA mileage estimate. I mean, that could be coded into a tag on every vehicle that could then communicate with the pump and then have, based on how much fuel you put in the vehicle, an estimate of how much you traveled could be calculated, and that fee could be charged appropriately. Scenario 5 would involve, rather than a dedicated fee collection center that might be state operated, that might be privately operated, or there might be several centers around the state, certainly. Scenario 5 considered actually using an existing state agency, such as the Department of Motor Vehicles, as the collection center. So the mechanisms for charging fees don't change here, but just who is actually processing. There was some discussion about the possibility of using the DMV facilities. I mean, the DMV facilities are located very carefully to be, within a short distance of, I think, what they try to do is locate the DMV facilities so they're convenient to all state residents. So this would be kind of a customer service plus if the DMV or other type of public service entity were involved in charging the fee. And then finally, scenario 6 is what we called system-wide spot tolling. And this would be a system where the state would deploy probably hundreds, if not more, of locations around the state where your vehicle and your VMT would be identified. So they would use a system to identify vehicles multiple times over the month or over the year, and then use that information to estimate your VMT. So that was a system that would not require fuel stations to be the receiving point for data. What I want to do now is acknowledge a lot of the people who provided this information. We had a technical advisory committee made up of ODOT staff, and Alan Kirk was the project manager. The Road User Fee Task Force themselves, and Jim Whitty is the administrator. Tom Kimple actually was a co-author on one of our first reports, and Jim Strathman. A number of students I've listed here, Shazia and Carrie are here. I think they're the only ones. Karen Karavanik from Computer Science contributed to a more recent report where we actually did a conceptual design for a data collection center and provided some cost estimates. Castle Rock Consultants also worked with us on the last phase of our study. And Lorna Youngs from the DMV and Professors Kim, Porter, and Whirl from OSU provided the slides that I just showed on the scenarios. I want to talk a little bit. The Rough Tough is, I think, actually meeting today, and right now. So they're not online, I don't think, but you will be able to see a lot of their materials on their website, the presentations and our reports. Several of our presentations, I think, are there also, but all the study documents are there. Meeting minutes and so on. And at the last slide, I'll give you the location of that website. But I want to just summarize for you, and this is not information that Tony or I generated. This is just a summary of what the Rough Tough is considering today, just to kind of give you a feel for what may be happening in the future as far as some testing that will be going on throughout the state. So the Rough Tough will be probably modifying and making formal decisions about this today. But I thought it was interesting to kind of see where they're headed now. They do plan to test some sort of central collection or fuel pump collection scenario using a gas tax credit system. So the idea seems to be that the gas tax is not going to be eliminated in any of these scenarios. So there would be a system where mileage data is recorded somehow, and then you are, if your VMT indicates that you owe more, then you will perhaps pay that at the pump or pay that through a monthly bill. If you require a refund, so if your gas tax payment is in excess of your VMT fee, then that would come back to you through your state income tax return. Okay? So a couple of the options that they're planning to look at, and perhaps we may have a chance to participate or to at least propose on some of these experiments in the future. They plan to look at using GPS or what we called the AVI odometer linked system, where there would be a way of communicating the status of your odometer through a short-range radio frequency communication to a service station. And then they're planning to look at some data collection options where you actually would pay the VMT at the service station, like I mentioned, or pay it via a monthly billing. The phase-in issue, the way they're handling it is they would plan to leave the gas tax in place. Enforcement, they're looking at several options, and I'm sure that this will require more research because this is kind of a legislative question. There would be some legal issues. Could they mandate participation in the VMT system by the mandate that the service station owners participate in the VMT system in order to sell fuel, and also mandate that drivers participate in order to purchase fuel? Other options would include using private collection systems where basically you could have a lien placed on your property or your assets if you didn't pay or didn't participate, or using some sort of traffic fine. So could you be stopped by law enforcement personnel and fined if you were found to be either violating or not participating in the system? The retrofitting phase-in issue, what they're planning would be not to require everyone to participate immediately, but to phase in with new vehicles and make participation in the system voluntary for older vehicle owners or owners of older vehicles. And privacy, basically, they're just saying this is going to be private, and that the design of the system would not allow for anyone else to retrieve data about where you've been, when you were there. As an example of this, there are numerous video cameras out on the freeways in Oregon, and none of that video is saved. None of it is recorded systematically. So if a law enforcement agency wanted to come and say, well, you know, we have this incident out there and we want to see what happened, there's no way to reconstruct that video. So this would be a similar system. The data would not be archived. Other than perhaps for administrative reasons, and there would be safeguards built in for protecting the public. The non-resident fee payment issue that Tony mentioned earlier, the proposal that they're discussing today would not explicitly resolve this issue. I think it's obviously an issue for more than one state to talk about. So interstate agreements could be pursued later, but the main thing is that the gas tax would be continued, so out-of-state drivers driving in Oregon, purchasing fuel in Oregon, would still pay the Oregon gas tax. And then the last statement, and again, this is not we're not responsible for this, but the last statement was that they would pursue congestion pricing overlays after the VMT fee is fully phased in. So there were some questions about, well, if only a portion of the fleet is on the VMT system, you know, you wouldn't have a mechanism for sort of area-wide congestion pricing. So this is how they're handling that. And here we go. The road user fee website is basically, you go to the ODOT website and type in /rough-tough, and there's also a link on the ODOT website. And as I mentioned, all the materials are there, and I think they've done a really good job of making all of the data available to the public. And so I think with that, we'll take some questions and discussion.
I need a little clarification on this testing. And,
Yes.
I was assuming that initially, at least, this testing is really to see if the technology works, and you would get volunteers, and they wouldn't really be paying, would they? Because why would they volunteer to do this if they really have to pay? And then secondly, you mentioned phasing in only with new vehicles. This is the proposal, new vehicles, and then retrofit old vehicles is optional. But again, why would anyone, I mean, if you're going to implement this, everyone has to do it. Otherwise, people would stop buying new cars if they have to pay to drive, right?
Well, I can provide some guesses, I think, at the way the testing will work, and I don't think the test plans have been fully developed, but the test would be voluntary, and I think they would do more than to see if the technology would work. I think it would be more to see how people reacted to using the system. So they would have a small sample of people or volunteers or, you know, PSU students or something like that participating in the system to get more than just technology. So it's more the whole sort of beginning to end, the whole array of issues beyond just technology.
But would they really pay?
That I don't know. I mean, maybe Tony can chime in.
The intent is to make the payments on average that come in through the VMT system less than what you would pay under the gas tax. So there would be an incentive for actually using the VMT system. And so the incentive would be that if you switch over to the VMT system, you'd actually have lower net payments.
Would that depend, though, on the efficiency of your vehicle? So in other words, people who would opt in are probably driving more efficient vehicles, maybe, or less efficient? Less efficient, actually.
Yeah, I mean, that is, you know, the self-selection issue is clearly a concern in terms of any voluntary system. But you could make the gas tax high enough that it would become in everyone's interest. And certainly if you're looking at the phase-in period that they're looking at, which is over 20 years, you could imagine that by the end of that period, there wouldn't be a substantial resistance to having the gas tax on average, say, twice as much as what you might pay under the VMT system.
What is the revenue differential that you're likely to face with storage switch?
Right now, the expectation is, I think, 1.2 cents per mile would generate about what the gas tax does. The big difference is that the administrative costs are substantially higher, and so what they're looking at is a differential for the VMT tax that would also cover the administrative cost and the amortization of the additional capital costs. And I forget the exact numbers, it's on the website somewhere, as to what their estimate would be of how much higher the VMT tax would have to be than the gas tax to generate the same amount of net revenue for the road fund.
So basically revenue neutral is the plan.
How is the weight of the vehicles handled through your funds? I mean, the useful thing, the gas tax is heavier vehicles tend to use more gasoline, whereas if you're only looking at vehicle miles traveled, then a heavy vehicle will actually benefit under such a system, and yet they produce more wear and tear. And I'm speaking mostly of the heavy trucks, but to a certain amount the SUVs.
Well, we mentioned this, but it really has not been discussed too much.
Well, basically, the conclusion that I have heard from the engineers is that when you're looking at light vehicles, and the SUVs would be included in that category, there really isn't any difference in the damage to the roads between a very heavy SUV and a very light subcompact car. The difference in road damage really only occurs at the relatively high weights, and the expectation is we would continue the weight mile tax for the heavy vehicles so that the coordination between road damage and user fees would continue. The VMT fee, again, the best information that I have is that the VMT fee should not be adjusted for weight of light vehicles because there really isn't enough of a difference in the impact on the road system to make it worthwhile.
Yeah, just one point maybe we didn't clarify at the beginning is this study only is looking at light vehicles, so the truck issue is completely separate, at least for the work that we did. And the other point is, just to amplify what Tony said, when you design pavement, the controlling factor is the truck traffic. So pavements are designed really, I mean, the controlling factor is how much truck traffic you have.
You did mention the increased technology in terms of fuel cell and alternative sources of transportation for cars, but all of your systems are integrated with existing dependence on gasoline. So what is your timetable for the world supply? I mean,
Mine.
do you foresee that within the next 50 years or so you'll have to have a new system, such as if you attach these computer programs to the gas pumps, you'll just have to then get new electric pumps or refueling sites. You'll have to think of another system relatively soon.
You're absolutely right. I mean, the systems they're looking at allow for communication with different, let's say, receivers. So receivers could be through the cellular system. There could be just a service center. It wouldn't matter where it was, but the data could be transmitted independently of where the fuel source was. If your fuel source was you had a fuel cell in your home, and maybe that was your daily fuel source for your vehicle, then you wouldn't be entering a service station. And maybe, I think that's probably beyond the time window of our study, but it's something that we considered in sort of laying out the design for systems that didn't depend on the service stations.
Yeah. One other thing, this isn't the only study that's being conducted. There's something called the Pooled Fund Study that is being coordinated through, Minnesota and the University of Iowa, that Oregon participates in, that envisions ultimately being able to track at the national level which jurisdiction a vehicle is traveling in and their total mileage, and to send them a bill at the end of the month based upon the price differentials for the different states. So I think what Oregon is looking at is more of a demonstration of a transition technology, and there's always the possibility that at the national level you would have this alternative technology in place in 20 years or something.
Very good question, though.
So it's called the road user system fee, and there are a number of road users that are not vehicles.
That's
So
right.
how are you going to address bicycles, pedestrians, Segway users, et cetera, et cetera? Would they have to pay a road user fee as well?
Not in our current, not in the context of the work that we've done, but very good point. I don't know, as I'm a pedestrian, I'm not sure that I pay for the use of the road, but we could implant me with a chip, I guess, right, and track me, like some dogs are implanted with chips. So, but I don't think the scope of this project didn't envision going beyond light vehicles.
How do you foresee addressing the out-of-state issue? Is there any opportunities with using the AVL data that you could recognize what's in-state, out-of-state?
Well, if couple points there. If your vehicle had a GPS system, had AVL, you could essentially determine when you were inside Oregon and when you were out. So if you had a year's worth of travel data, you could have algorithms that could calculate your total in-state mileage. So that's doable. So that addresses the issue of what if you leave Oregon and you're not using Oregon's roads. The question of if someone comes into Oregon, if they're not participating in the system, there would be no way, unless there was some sort of national system that Tony mentioned that may occur in the future. Shana.
That brings up a question for me. I mean, Washington State must know that we're engaged in this sort of study, and I'm wondering if they're engaged in anything of the kind, and if there have been any kind of preliminary discussions about what we might do if such a test scenario bears out for neighbors.
I believe Puget Sound Regional Council is looking to do a similar type of study for tracking vehicles in the Puget Sound region. And I think there are probably similar programs in a variety of other places. I don't know of any formal discussions between the states. I think right now each state is looking at it on their own. And then if we ever got to the point where we're actually going to try and implement something, I think you'd then start seeing some coordination.
I have a money question. So how is this testing phase looking with regard to the budget crisis that's is facing Oregon this year and the following biennium? Is it fully funded? I'm sorry, I missed the very beginning of it.
The road fund is completely independent from the general fund. It is funded by gas tax and other and registration fees. So in effect, the road fund is not affected by the budget crisis. It is completely insulated. The other thing is that part of the funding for this is from the federal government through the value pricing program, and that money, as far as I know, is also committed. So the issue of the funding for the program really depends upon what's happening with the road fund. I gather the revenues are coming in a little bit less than projected because of reductions in mileage and so on, but it's not anywhere near the magnitude that you're seeing with the state general fund.
And I believe in general they have funds budgeted for the experimental phase that's part of the establishment of the task force itself and the value pricing funds.
This issue of people, if we did phase out or reduce the state gas tax, people coming from Washington, particularly since we do full service, legally, can you charge out-of-state vehicles a higher tax? And wouldn't that take care of it?
Tony?
Legally, I doubt that you could. That would violate interstate commerce clauses. What they're intending to do, as I said, I think, is to keep the gas tax in place, and then eventually to have the effective gas tax being higher than the VMT fee, and using that as an incentive for people to voluntarily choose to enter the VMT program. But again, I think you're looking at a really long-term outcome that, in the short term, they're just looking at testing the technology.
I believe Senator Starr, who's the chair of the task force, Bruce Starr, I believe I've heard him mention that one of his visions is to index the state gas tax to inflation. So that's sort of a separate issue that they're also looking at. Yes.
Okay, make sure I understand this. From your graph you showed in the beginning of the slide, you talked about how Oregon's revenue is a little bit less than other states. And so I understand that this, the gas tax is going to continue, and this is going to be an additional revenue source in the short term. And in the long term, it will take over as the only revenue source, if I understand it right. So have you talked about the scenario of, in the long term, if people are willing to pay the price and traffic congestion rises, will the prices just go up? Is this going to be a part of a process of reducing road miles traveled? And if so, is it just raising the gas tax just as good of a way?
There are two issues here. One is the question of how much revenue you're generating. My guess is that the intention in the short run is that the VMT fee would simply replace the gas tax, and in particular would be a substitute for the very high efficiency vehicles. The question of using the VMT fee in order to reduce the amount of mileage basically comes down to congestion pricing. And most of the analysis indicates that if you did some form of congestion pricing, you would get much better usage, much more efficient usage of the roads. The question of using just higher prices to reduce the amount of driving that is done, the gas tax basically has very little impact. What you find is that people's choice of how much they're going to drive is not overly sensitive to the gas tax because it's such a small percentage of the cost of driving. And if you think about it, the current gas tax, what is it, about $120 a year for the average driver?
Something like that, yeah.
It's, people react to it and to suggestions for changing it, but as a practical matter, it doesn't affect them very much because it's such a small amount.
I'm a follow-up. So does that mean with the new system you're proposing, a person could maybe drive more, paying less taxes, as long as they don't drive during the real congestion prices?
If you had congestion pricing, that is the intent, yes, that you would want to, basically the capacity of the road system is determined by the number of users at the peak period. And you tend to have to build more, and you also create problems for other road users because of driving at congested periods. Driving in non-congested periods, especially for light vehicles, really doesn't place a cost on the road fund. They don't really damage the roads very much, and they're not using up capacity.
But I think that the VMT fee is in some ways linked, but not. You can have the VMT fee without congestion pricing, but part of what they're doing is looking at how congestion pricing would work with the VMT system. So could you, congestion pricing can be done in lots of ways. Cordons are one way. Specific facility fees where you would, like the toll collection systems where you pay when you get on and you get off and you pay for the amount of distance that you traveled. So those are things that can be implemented kind of on top of the basic VMT system.
I just have a question for Tony. What fee collection system are they going to use in London? Because it's like a fast.
As I understand the London system, and I'm not sure you should quote me on this, we had a presentation at TRB. My understanding is that if you use the roads during the period when the fee is in place, you're supposed to call in and pay or do it over the internet or something. And then if you don't, and they've identified that you've been driving in downtown London, they will start sending you notices of fines.
One of the proposed solutions for this interstate issue is having global positioning system units in cars. I was wondering about the cost of that, and will the cost of GPS units go down and what they are now, so this would be affordable.
Yeah, the prices have come down. I have a little Palm Pilot with a GPS receiver, and the GPS thing was I think $60. But right now, to add on a navigation system to a vehicle, the sticker price of that is probably between $1,000 and $2,000. Probably the question is how much cost would be passed on to the user if it was integrated in the vehicle. We're talking certainly hundreds of dollars at the moment. Did that answer all of your?
just a little follow-up. The other concern is the cost of computing. It's not just the GPS system, it's also the question of tracking where the mileage has been and so on. So if you're going to put a computer in the car and attach it to the GPS system and also put in a cellular phone, that raises the cost substantially.
Yeah, in our most recent analysis, that one of the major costs in a system like this would be actually the communication costs from the vehicles to the service center. The device, I mean, the pieces of, if you had a car now with a navigation system in it, it already has a computer, it already has the GPS, it already has the mapping software in there if you needed to do anything with mapping, and the cars with telematics already have several cellular phones in them. So on the simplest level with just the odometer reading, I mean, there's probably very little cost to hardware cost to modify that. But if you're adding computing power, communications, and GPS, it does add up.
Have you talked at all to the modeling folks? It seems to me that having this data and being able to use this data for modeling purposes would greatly benefit the accuracy of our travel demand forecasts.
That's implicit, I think, in all of these studies, that basically you would have real origin-destination data for the first time. Did we in this work we didn't specifically talk to modelers, but it's pretty implicit in this, and I don't know if anybody has come up with a mechanism for sifting out the data in an anonymous way, but it would be possible to extract data without user information for modeling purposes. Tony, did you?
I was just going to say that you do run into the privacy issue, and you really do have to make sure that the method by which you do it is going to be one that we guarantee anonymity for the users, or otherwise you're going to run into all kinds of other concerns.
Absolutely. Irina.
I'd like to follow up pretty much on what Tony said with the question. What kind of safeguards, if any, are there in this testing phase that would prohibit the system to be incorporated into the Homeland Security actions?
Well, if you look at the description of the proposal for the testing phase, it's actually a design. I can't remember the exact term, but it's a design restriction that the data would be 100% private. So, to the extent to which
special rules and some emergency rules, because the system is designed perfectly to track anybody,
right?
Especially when it's implemented. And given what's been happening in last year, and so. Anybody's talking about it seriously?
Well, I haven't talked about it explicitly with anyone, but I think this question is implicit in anything we do now, and so I don't know if the task force has dealt with it explicitly, but it may be something that comes up at their meeting today.
And also as a follow-up, the pooled fund study has put a lot of effort into mechanisms for maintaining privacy of the information, and the systems that they're looking at in Oregon, I don't think have addressed the privacy concerns as much, but there are encryption techniques and things like that that have been developed for the pooled fund study that address some of those concerns.
And also the toll collection systems we have now, they basically do protect people's privacy. So there are systems that have been set up for the toll collection systems. So, in sort of in two ways, that the data are actually encrypted. So when data are transferred from the location where the vehicle's passage are recorded, that's encrypted, and so anybody who's processing the data doesn't know exactly who passed which point when. And also, I would imagine with a VMT system, you could even allow for some sort of anonymous participation if you wanted. You could have people, pay cash, sort of charge up their system. I suppose, anonymous participation could be possible. And as I said before, very few people in the toll collection side want to be anonymous. I mean, most people are just happy to go online and charge their credit card. Right. I mean, but it's important to mention that in the national level thinking that's going on, and Tony's been involved with this, that privacy has been a big concern, and systems have been developed for a nationwide application. But obviously, as you mentioned, things do change.
Can I just clarify on all these issues? With the odometer-driven readings, I mean, are these location benefits and the privacy issues as much of an issue as they are with the GPS?
No, just reporting mileage, I think, would have very little privacy concern.
It's not really locational stuff associated with that.
Not at all. It's just distance. One last question.
Very technological question. You mentioned a 20-year implementation period, transition period, and I was just wondering why it would be necessary to have such a long time until the system was in effect.
Basically, the issue is the turnover in the fleet. If you look out there, there are still a lot of vehicles that are 20 years or older. And I gather from reading the discussions in the Rough Tough committee that that's sort of what they're looking at as sort of the largest, a large percentage of the fleet would have turned over within 20 years.
All right. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.